Sienna Blake pressed her red-painted lips against Ethan Calloway's jaw. Right there, in the center of the Blackwood Grand Ballroom, in front of 400 people. And she smiled while she did it. Not the smile of a woman in love. The smile of a woman making a point. She turned to face the room, let her diamond earrings catch the chandelier light, and said, loud enough for the nearest two tables to hear, "I think it's time New York stopped pretending his wife ever belonged here." The room went quiet in that particular way that means everyone heard, and no one will admit it. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated in public and felt your blood go cold, stay with me, because tonight, everything changes. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if this is your kind of story, hit that like button right now. Let's begin. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier. Vivian Sterling found it on the silver tray in the front hall of the apartment she still shared, technically, with her husband Ethan Calloway. She picked it up, read it once, set it back down, and walked to the kitchen to pour herself a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She drank it anyway. The Blackwood Foundation Annual Charity Gala. Black tie. Saturday, October 14th. The Grand Ballroom, Hotel Vantage. For most women in her circle, an invitation like that was a social lifeline. Proof you still mattered, still registered on the radar of the people who decided such things. For Vivian, it was something else. It was a date on a calendar, an ex she'd been counting toward for 4 months. She was 47 years old. She had silver beginning to thread through her dark hair that she had stopped coloring 6 months ago, a decision that had prompted her stylist, her mother, and 3 of her former friends to offer unsolicited opinions. She was 5'6" and had the posture of a woman who had learned early that the room noticed when you walked in like you meant to be there. She was not, by the metrics of the world she'd married into, what most people would call a threat. That was, of course, the point. The story of Ethan Calloway and Sienna Blake was not a complicated one, as these stories go. It had the basic architecture of 100 others told in the gossip columns and the whisper networks of Manhattan's Upper East Side. A man who had made too much money too fast, a wife who had stood beside him through the building years and been quietly shelved once the penthouse was purchased, and a younger woman who appeared at precisely the moment his ego needed tending. Sienna was 31. She had the kind of beauty that photographed spectacularly and in person landed slightly differently. Striking, yes, but with an edge to it, a calculation visible in the way her eyes moved around any room she entered, cataloging. She had appeared in Ethan's orbit through the art world, one of those gallery openings where the wine is better than the work. And within 3 months, she was being photographed with him at charity events, her hand in the crook of his arm, her smile angled for the cameras with the precision of someone who had been practicing. Vivian had not made a scene. That was the thing that surprised everyone, and that no one quite understood, and that the tabloids eventually turned into a narrative of their own choosing. Jilted wife retreats in humiliation. Sterling hides. As Calloway moves on. Page 6 ran a photo of Sienna in a violet gown at the Metropolitan Museum benefit, Ethan's hand at her back, and captioned it, "The new Mrs. Calloway?" Sources say the original is keeping a very low profile. The original had read that caption in her kitchen at 7:30 in the morning and had not thrown the paper across the room. She had not cried. She had made a note in the small leather-bound notebook she kept beside her coffee maker, closed it, and gone to her study. What Vivian had been doing in those long months of silence was not hiding. She had started with the prenuptial agreement, which she had signed 22 years ago at 25 years old, and which she had read approximately 12 times in the past 4 months, with an attention she had never brought to it as a young bride. The prenup was ironclad. Ethan's lawyers had made sure of that, but it contained, buried in subsection 14C, a clause regarding financial misconduct and concealment of assets that voided its protections entirely in the event of documented fraud. Ethan had been moving money. It had started as best Vivian's forensic accountant could reconstruct about 3 years ago. Shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Transfers that ran through a consulting firm that existed only on paper. A real estate holding in Ethan's mother's name that had somehow accumulated $7 million in the last 18 months, Despite his mother being 74 years old and living in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona, where she played bridge on Tuesdays and had not, to anyone's knowledge, been involved in real estate investment of any kind. Vivian had not gone looking for this out of spite. She had gone looking because 22 years of marriage had taught her that when Ethan started restructuring things quietly, it meant he was preparing for something. She had seen it twice before. Once before a major business pivot, once before he fired his longtime CFO in a move that blindsided everyone. Ethan Callaway did not improvise. He prepared the ground. He was preparing the ground to leave her with nothing. Bobo. The accountant's name was Richard Cho, and he was 63 years old and had the quiet, meticulous energy of a man who genuinely loved spreadsheets. He had been recommended to Vivian by her divorce attorney, Margaret Osei, who had handled 3 of the largest settlement cases in Manhattan in the previous decade, and who had the particular quality of stillness that Vivian had found deeply reassuring in their first meeting. "He's been moving assets for at least 36 months, Richard had told Vivian, sliding a bound document across the conference table toward her. "Probably longer, but the paper trail gets cleaner the further back you go. He knew what he was doing." "How much?" "What we can document? Somewhere between 18 and 22 million. There's more we can't fully trace yet." Vivian had looked at that number for a long moment. "What do you need to finish the trace?" "Time," Richard said, "and access to 2 more sets of bank records that Margaret's team is currently working on getting through the discovery process." "The gala is October 14th, Vivian said. Richard looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Is that a deadline?" "It's a date I'd like to be ready by." He had looked at her for another moment, then nodded once and gathered his papers. "I'll need weekends." "Bill accordingly," Vivian said. "Tick." In the 6 weeks between that meeting and the night of the gala, Vivian also did the following things. She had lunch with Caroline Blackwood, who was 71 years old, the widow of the foundation's founder, and the woman whose name was on every invitation sent to every important person in New York. Caroline Blackwood had known Vivian for 15 years. She had watched Ethan's behavior with the resigned disapproval of a woman who had seen men behave badly in every possible configuration and had stopped being surprised but had never stopped being annoyed. That lunch lasted 3 hours. She had 2 separate conversations with David Park, who edited the business section of a publication that Ethan's publicist had been carefully cultivating for years, and who was owed nothing by Ethan Callaway, and had, Vivian happened to know, been looking for a way into a story about irregularities in Callaway Capital's offshore structures for the better part of 8 months. She had a fitting. The fitting took 4 sessions over 3 weeks and involved a designer named Camille Tran, who was 44, worked out of a studio in the West Village, and made clothes the way certain people told stories, with patience, with intention, and with a complete indifference to what was fashionable. The dress she made for Vivian was not a statement piece, in the conventional sense. It was not red. It was not dramatic. It was deep navy, almost black, cut with a severity that somehow became elegant on Vivian's frame, and it had sleeves which no one wore anymore, and it was completely, utterly right. "You're going somewhere specific in this," Camille said, on the last fitting, adjusting a seam at the shoulder. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Vivian said, "somewhere you want to be remembered." Vivian looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. "Somewhere I want to be seen." October 14th arrived cold and clear, the way early fall evenings in New York sometimes do. A sky that had been pale all day, suddenly deepening at dusk into something sharp and blue, the city's lights coming up with a clarity that made it look, just for an hour, like the place it pretended to be in movies. Vivian arrived at Hotel Vantage at 7:45. Ethan and Sienna had arrived at 7:15, which she knew because Margaret's assistant had texted her from a table near the entrance, and because Sienna had posted a photo on Instagram at 7:18 captioned, "The kind of evening that reminds you why you live here," in which Ethan's profile was visible at the edge of the frame, and Sienna herself was wearing an ivory gown that Vivian's stylist had informed her, with a certain professional precision, cost $18,000 and was borrowed from a designer who was clearly trying to buy visibility. The car stopped in front of the hotel. Thomas, who had driven Vivian to events for 11 years, met her eyes in the rearview mirror. He was 67 and had seen a great deal during those 11 years and said very little of it. "Ready?" he asked. I've been ready since March, Vivian said. She got out of the car. The entrance to the Blackwood Gala was a long marble corridor lined on both sides with the kind of flowers that cost a fortune and look effortless. And it served, as all such corridors do, as a runway, a stretch of space in which arrivals were noted, catalogued, and filed away by the people who stood in clusters with their champagne and their professionally practiced expressions of mild interest. Vivian walked it alone. She had considered, briefly, bringing someone. Her friend Patricia had offered, half-jokingly, to play the role of supportive companion. You shouldn't have to walk in there by yourself, Patricia had said. Not with everything, not with all of them watching. I know, Vivian had said. That's why I'm going alone. There was something about a woman walking into a room alone that was categorically different from a woman walking in with someone on her arm. A companion was armor. Vivian had decided, at some point in the past few months, that she was done wearing armor. Armor communicated vulnerability. It said, I need protecting. She walked in alone and the corridor did its work. She saw the eyes move to her, and then she saw the specific quality of that attention shift. The way it went from the automatic cataloging of any new arrival to something more focused, more uncertain. She had not been seen in this world for 4 months. She had been written off. And here she was, in a dress that fit her like a decision, her silver-threaded hair caught up in a way that was simple and exact, her posture saying nothing that needed to be said out loud. She did not look for Ethan. She did not look for Sienna. She looked for Caroline Blackwood, who was standing near the center of the room with the relaxed authority of a woman on her own territory, and who caught Vivian's eye across the ballroom and smiled, very slightly, and lifted her champagne glass a half-inch in greeting. Vivian crossed the room toward her. Oh, she heard Sienna before she saw her. I think it's time New York stopped pretending his wife ever belonged here. The voice was not loud enough to carry the room, but it was loud enough, calibrated to be loud enough for the cluster of people immediately surrounding the table near the east windows, where Ethan sat with his arm draped across the back of Sienna's chair, looking slightly uncomfortable in the way that men look when they are aware that something is happening that they should be monitoring but cannot quite identify. Vivian stopped walking, not because the words had hit her the way Sienna intended, that old lightning rod of social humiliation, the thing that was supposed to make her feel small and misplaced and sorry for existing in a room where she was no longer welcome. She stopped because she had heard it, clearly, and she wanted to register it. She wanted to hold it for a moment, complete. His wife ever belonged here. A woman 2 tables away, Janet Hargrove, 63, whose husband sat on the board of Callaway Capital and who had been pointedly not calling Vivian for 4 months, had heard it too. Vivian could see it in the particular stillness that came over Janet's face, and next to Janet, her husband, Gerald, who was looking at his plate. The room, or the part of the room that mattered, was holding its breath. Vivian turned. She did not move towards Sienna. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anything. She simply turned and looked in Sienna's direction and let the look carry whatever it was carrying, which was not hurt, and was not anger exactly, but was something quieter than either, something that had been sitting still for 4 months and was no longer interested in staying that way. Sienna saw her. Whatever she had expected, absence or distance, or the particular defeated look of a woman who had accepted the story being written about her, it was not this. Sienna's expression did something complicated and fast, like a screen refreshing. The smile stayed on her face but changed quality entirely, went from weapon to reflex. Ethan turned his head. Vivian held the moment exactly as long as she needed to, and then she looked away and continued walking across the room toward Caroline Blackwood, who had watched all of this without moving an inch, and who, as Vivian reached her, said quietly, "You look extraordinary." "Thank you for the table placement," Vivian said. Caroline took a small sip of champagne. The Foundation's accountant reviewed the proposed donor list last week, found some irregularities. The Blackwood board will be discussing it next Thursday. "I know," Vivian said. "David Park is here," Caroline said. "He arrived at 7:30. "I know that too." Caroline looked at her steadily. "Are you sure about all of this, Vivian? Once it starts—" "It already started," Vivian said. "It started the moment he decided I wouldn't notice." A waiter materialized with champagne. Vivian took a glass. The chandelier above them was throwing light across the whole room. Across the tables and the flowers and the 400 people in their silk and their diamonds and their careful, careful faces. And somewhere across that room, Ethan Calloway was watching his wife stand in the center of it, and something in his expression, Vivian knew without looking, had shifted. Good, she thought. Let it shift. The night was just beginning. Caroline Blackwood had known 3 kinds of powerful women in her 71 years. The first kind announced themselves, walked into rooms loudly, demanded attention, built their power on visibility. The second kind inherited it, wore it like a coat someone else had sewn, and spent their lives making sure the seams didn't show. The third kind, the rarest kind, built it quietly, in the margins, while everyone was looking somewhere else. She had suspected for a while now that Vivian Sterling was the third kind. Standing here tonight, watching Vivian hold that room with nothing more than her posture and a look that lasted 4 seconds, Caroline was no longer guessing. "Your table is near the podium," Caroline said as the two of them moved toward the inner edge of the ballroom. 8. Close enough to matter. Close enough to be seen from table 12, Vivian said. It was not a question. Caroline did not ask how Vivian knew which table Ethan had been assigned. He requested the east side. I put him west. I noticed. They walked in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that had substance to it. Two women who had spent enough time in rooms like this to understand that the real conversations happened in the margins, in the half-sentences, in what didn't need to be explained. The orchestra was playing something low and unobtrusive near the far wall, and the room had settled back into its social rhythms after Vivian's arrival. Conversations resuming, champagne being refreshed, the brief disruption absorbed into the larger event the way these things always were. But the disruption had happened, and certain people had registered it with an attention that would not fade before the night was over. "David is at the bar," Caroline said, tilting her chin slightly left without looking. "He's been there since 7:40. Nursing the same drink." Vivian glanced in that direction. David Park was 51, compact, with the watchful quality of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where things were said for attribution and rooms where they weren't, and had learned to tell the difference in under a minute. He was wearing a jacket that needed pressing and holding a glass of soda water and looking at nothing in particular, which meant he was looking at everything. "I'll speak with him before 9, Vivian said. "Not here. There's a smaller room off the east corridor, the reading room they use for overflow. He knows it." "And Gerald Hargrove?" Caroline asked. "He's been watching you since you walked in." "Gerald Hargrove is going to do whatever protects Gerald Hargrove," Vivian said. "That's fine. That's actually useful." She paused. Janet looked away when Sienna said what she said. "I saw that." Janet Hargrove has spent 15 years building herself a reputation as the kind of woman who doesn't tolerate a certain kind of behavior. She's co-chair of the Women's Leadership Committee at the Whitmore Foundation. She wrote a check last year to a domestic advocacy organization and had the photo taken. Vivian kept her voice level, not cold, just precise. "She can't be seen to be on the wrong side of this. She just doesn't know yet which side that is." Caroline looked at her sidelong. "You've been doing a lot of thinking." "I had a lot of time," Vivian said simply. They reached table 8. Vivian set her clutch on the seat, rested her hand on the back of the chair for a moment, and looked out at the room. From here she had a clear sight line to table 12, where Ethan was now standing with 2 men she recognized. Marcus Webb, who ran a private equity firm that had partnered with Callaway Capital on 3 deals in the last 4 years, and someone she didn't know, younger, blonde, in an expensive suit that was slightly wrong for the room, the way suits were when someone had money, but not yet the particular knowledge that came from spending money in the same rooms for long enough. Sienna was still seated. She was holding her champagne glass and talking to the woman beside her, but her eyes were moving, doing that catalog work that Vivian had noticed when Sienna first entered her life as a figure on the periphery, tracking the room, tracking Vivian, tracking the distance between what she'd expected tonight to be and what it was currently becoming. Ethan had not looked at Vivian again. That, too, was telling. When Ethan Calloway didn't look at something, it meant he was thinking about it very hard. Vivian sat down. The woman to her left was Patricia Ngo, 61, who had been Vivian's closest friend for 14 years and who had arrived early specifically to be at this table, and who now looked at Vivian with the expression of someone who has been watching from behind glass and is both proud and terrified. You walked in like that on purpose, Patricia said. I walked in. Don't do that. You know exactly what you did. Vivian picked up her water glass. How are the children? Vivian. Patricia. Patricia let out a breath. She was a tall woman with natural hair she kept short, an oncologist who had dealt with a particular kind of terrible news for 30 years and had developed a directness that she deployed without apology. He's watching you. He's been watching you since you sat down. He's just doing it when you're not looking. I know. And the girl, she's not a girl, she's 31. The woman, Patricia corrected. She looked like she'd seen something she wasn't prepared for. She saw me, Vivian said. She's been operating in a version of this world where I'm a footnote. It's disorienting when the footnote shows up. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are you actually okay? Not the performance. You, underneath all of this. Vivian set down the water glass. She looked at her hands for a second, her left hand specifically, where the wedding ring was no longer. She'd taken it off 2 months ago, not dramatically, not in a gesture, just removed it one morning and placed it in the small dish on her dresser where she kept earrings she wore infrequently and had not put it back. No one had written about it because no one had been close enough to notice, or those who had were not talking. I'm angry, she said quietly. I've been angry for a long time, but I'm okay. Okay, Patricia said. And then, because she was Patricia and 14 years of friendship had its own grammar, the dress is extraordinary. I know, Vivian said, and this time it came with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. The first course arrived. The room moved into its dinner rhythms, and across the ballroom Vivian was aware, without looking, that Ethan Calloway had finally sat back down, and that he had refilled his wine glass, and that Marcus Webb was talking to him with the slightly too animated quality of a man filling silence because the silence had become uncomfortable. The night had its architecture. Vivian had built it carefully. Now she let it run. The dinner itself lasted 90 minutes, and across those 90 minutes, Vivian did what she had always been better at than anyone who had underestimated her. She was present. She talked to the man to her right, a surgeon named Howard Klein, who was on the foundation's board and who had an unexpectedly dry sense of humor and a genuine passion for early 20th century jazz. She listened to Patricia argue with the woman across the table about the city's infrastructure investment priorities, a conversation that went 15 minutes and solved nothing, and was somehow deeply satisfying to observe. She laughed twice, genuinely, at things Howard said. She ate most of her meal, which she had been uncertain about earlier in the week when the anticipatory adrenaline had made food feel beside the point. She did not perform composure. She did not perform anything. She was simply, and this was the thing that Sienna Blake, watching from table 12, could not quite process, she was simply there, in a way that suggested she had never not been there, had never spent 4 months in the margins of her own life, had never been written about as a woman in retreat. The narrative had been that Vivian Sterling was hiding. Hiding looked like this room, where everyone could see her. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, Ethan excused himself from his table. Vivian tracked this in her peripheral vision, his movement away from table 12, through the outer ring of tables toward the corridor. She counted to 40, said something brief to Howard about returning in a moment, set her napkin on her chair, and followed. She did not hurry. The east corridor of Hotel Vantage was long and carpeted in deep burgundy, lit by sconces that cast warm light at intervals, with the reading room at the far end behind a heavy oak door that was currently slightly ajar. This was not where Ethan had gone. He'd turned toward the smaller bar area near the cloakroom, but it was where she needed to go first. She pushed open the reading room door. David Park was inside, sitting in one of the leather armchairs with his jacket open and his soda water replaced by, now something with ice and amber coloring, a sign that the social portion of the evening had shifted for him into working mode. He looked up when she came in and did not stand, which she appreciated. "Vivian," he said. Not Mrs. Calloway. He'd never called her that. "David." She closed the door behind her and sat across from him. The room smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner. There was a shelf of books behind David's head that had probably never been opened. "How much do you have?" "Enough to run it. My editor cleared space in next Thursday's edition, pending confirmation on 2 items. "Which items?" "The Delaware Holding Company. I have registration documents. I have transfer records. I need one source on the record confirming the structure was intentional concealment rather than, say, bad accounting. Richard Cho will go on record, Vivian said. He's been deposed in 3 federal cases. He's credible. David made a note. Second item, the Meridian Partners connection. I can trace the money from Callaway Capital to Meridian, and I can trace Meridian to a real estate portfolio in Miami, but I have a 3-month gap in the transaction record that I can't. March through June, 2 years ago, Vivian said. She reached into her clutch and removed a folded set of papers. 4 pages, printed small, dense with figures. She held them out. Margaret's team got these through subpoena last week. The gap closes. David took the papers and looked at them for a long moment without speaking. Outside the reading room, distantly, she could hear the orchestra resuming. The dinner portion of the evening was ending. The program would begin in 20 minutes. Caroline's remarks, the award presentations, the auction. Vivian, this isn't a financial scandal, David said slowly, looking up from the papers. If these numbers are right, this is potentially criminal. The SEC has a word for this. I know what the SEC has a word for it, she said. I've spoken with Margaret. We're filing a separate complaint with the SEC on Monday morning. The story and the filing will land in the same news cycle. David looked at her with something that was not quite admiration and not quite discomfort, but was somewhere between the two. The look of a journalist confronting a source who is more prepared than he is. You've been building this for a while. Since March, she said. Does he know? She thought about it honestly. He knows something is wrong. He noticed sometime in the last month that I've been quieter than usual. Ethan mistakes quiet for absence. He always has. She paused. That's his problem, not mine. David looked back at the papers. I need 48 hours to verify and write. You have until Wednesday, she said. Publication Thursday. Filing Monday. That's the sequence. And tonight? She stood, smoothed the front of her dress, picked up her clutch. Tonight is the last night anyone in that room thinks this story ends the way they've been assuming it ends. She said it without drama, just factually, the way you might report weather. I need to get back in there. One more thing, David said. He said it to her back as she was reaching for the door. She stopped. The Sienna Blake angle, is that part of the story? Vivian turned her head slightly, but didn't turn around all the way. Sienna Blake is a woman who made a calculation about what kind of man Ethan was and bet her future on it. She'll find out whether she was right. A beat. That's not my story to tell. My story is about the money. She opened the door and walked back into the corridor. Ethan was there. He was standing 12 feet away, just past the corridor's first sconce, with his hands in his pockets and his expression doing that thing it did when he was working out a problem. A slight tightening around the eyes, the jaw not quite clenched but moving in that direction. He was 52 years old and still handsome in the way some men were at that age, the kind of looks that had settled into authority rather than faded. He was wearing his black tie the way he always wore it at these events, the slight loosening at the collar that he thought looked relaxed, and that Vivian had always privately found performative. They stood in the corridor and looked at each other, 22 years accumulated in the space between them. The apartment on Park Avenue where they'd moved 3 months after their wedding, the too-small kitchen where they'd eaten takeout on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, the miscarriage at 12 weeks, 11 years in, that had rearranged something between them quietly and permanently, a weight that neither of them had ever found quite the right words for. The building years, the company growing, the dinners, the events, the careful cultivation of a world that demanded cultivation, Vivian doing the unglamorous architectural work of that world, while Ethan was its public face. The moment, which she could date exactly to a Tuesday afternoon in November 4 years ago, when she had looked at him across their dining room table and understood, without any single piece of evidence, that he had already begun to leave. She had not said anything that Tuesday. She was saying something now, she supposed, just not with words. I didn't know you were coming, Ethan said finally. I was invited. You didn't RSVP. I responded directly to Caroline. She held his gaze. Is that a problem? He looked at the reading room door, still slightly warm from her having just been on the other side of it. What were you doing in there? Saying hello to someone, she said it simply, without inflection. How are you, Ethan? The question seemed to catch him off guard, which was the point. He blinked. I'm fine. I'm fine. He shifted his weight, hands still in his pockets, that problem-solving tightening still visible around his eyes. You look... He stopped himself. What? He seemed to decide against whatever he'd been about to say. You seem well. I am well, she said. Another silence. The orchestra, from somewhere deep in the building, transitioned into something with more structure to it, a signal that the formal program was approaching. Vivian, his voice dropped. I think we should talk. About the timeline. Margaret's office sent over some paperwork last week, and I think there are some things that need to be... We'll talk through the attorneys, she said. That's what they're there for. I'm not talking about the attorneys. I'm talking about... He pulled one hand out of his pocket, made a vague gesture that encompassed the corridor, the Gala, the life they'd built together, and were now disassembling. This. All of this. I don't want it to be... What? She kept her voice even. Messy? Public? She tilted her head slightly. Or did you want it to stay quiet? The way it's been quiet. He had the decency, or the instinct, to look uncomfortable. I didn't think you'd come tonight. She let the question sit there. Come tonight the way you came tonight, he said. And she could see it in his face now, the thing she'd heard in David Park's voice. The recognition that the person across from him was more prepared than he'd assumed, that the architecture of whatever he'd been planning needed revision. Something's different. Yes, Vivian agreed pleasantly. It is. She did not tell him what was different. She did not gesture toward David Park in the reading room, or the papers she'd delivered, or Monday morning, or Thursday's edition. She let him stand in the corridor with the weight of his own incomplete understanding, which was, she had decided some months ago, exactly where he deserved to be. I should get back in, she said. Caroline's remarks start soon. You know she hates it when people miss the opening. She walked past him back toward the ballroom. He did not follow immediately. She could feel him standing there, watching her go, the problem unresolved behind his eyes. Good, she thought, for the second time that evening. Let it be unresolved. Back at table 8, Patricia had traded seats with Howard and was now talking to a woman named Denise Farrow, who sat on the board of 3 significant nonprofits and who had spent the last 20 minutes, judging by Patricia's expression, saying things that were revealing in ways Denise probably hadn't intended. Vivian slid into her seat and Patricia glanced at her with one raised eyebrow, a 14-year question compressed into a gesture. Vivian gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. But it's moving. Patricia nodded and turned back to Denise. At table 12, Sienna had refilled her champagne. She was talking to the blonde man in the slightly wrong suit, but there was a tension in her posture now, a rigidity in the way she held her glass that hadn't been there during dinner. She was watching the corridor entrance, waiting for Ethan to reappear. When he did, 3 minutes later, she leaned toward him and said something that Vivian couldn't hear from across the room, but which produced on Ethan's face an expression she recognized. The particular arrangement of his features when he was managing 2 problems simultaneously and resented that both of them required management. He said something back to Sienna, brief, and touched her shoulder once, and sat down. Sienna did not look satisfied. The lights in the ballroom shifted slightly. A warm dimming toward the main stage, where Caroline Blackwood was now approaching the podium with the measured pace of a woman who had given variations of this speech for 30 years and understood that what she was really delivering was not remarks but permission. Permission for the room to feel that the money it had spent on tickets and tables had been spent on something worthwhile, that the rituals of charity events served some purpose beyond their own continuation. Caroline was good at this. She was, in fact, extraordinary at it. She began. The room settled. Vivian watched from table 8 as the faces around the ballroom shifted into that particular receptive mode that these events cultivated. Attentive, warm, collectively engaged in the performance of caring about the right things. Ethan was watching the stage. Marcus Webb was watching the stage. Gerald Hargrove was watching the stage. Janet Hargrove was watching Vivian. Vivian caught her eye. Janet's expression was a complicated piece of work. 15 years of social calculation compressed into a single look, The arithmetic of where a woman's loyalties were required to land in order to preserve what she'd built and the reputation she'd attached to it. She looked away first, but not before Vivian had seen what she'd needed to see in it. Janet knew something was happening. She was trying to decide whether to be a bystander or whether to pick a side before the sides became obvious to everyone. The decision would come. Vivian was not in a hurry. Caroline's remarks ran for 10 minutes. She spoke about the Foundation's work in public health education across the 5 boroughs, about the difference between charity and investment, about her late husband's belief that New York's capacity for self-renewal was not a myth but a practice, built brick by people willing to put something in before they took anything out. It was a good speech. It had a line in the middle about what it meant to build something that outlasted you, that landed with genuine feeling in the room. Vivian thought about that line longer than she meant to. Then the auction began. The Blackwood Charity Auction was one of the few auctions of its kind that still generated genuine competition among the bidders, partly because Caroline's curation was impeccable, and partly because the items offered were designed with the specific psychology of the room's wealthy in mind. Experiences, not objects. Access, not things. Tonight's items included a private sailing trip for 12 in the Adriatic, a commissioned portrait by an artist whose waiting list ran 3 years, a week at a private conservation reserve in Botswana that did not advertise itself, and the last item, always the most fought over, a naming opportunity on the Foundation's new pediatric research initiative. That last item always produced the room's most revealing moment: who bid, who didn't, how far they went, what they were willing to pay to have their name attached to something that mattered, or to be seen paying it. Ethan Callaway had won that item 2 years in a row. It was the kind of move that served multiple purposes: tax efficiency, reputational cultivation, the specific signal to the room that Callaway Capital was not merely wealthy, but institutionally engaged. His bids had run $350,000 and then $400,000 in consecutive years. Tonight, the opening bid was set at $200,000. Vivian watched the bidding from her seat. Marcus Webb opened at $250,000. A tech founder named Jacobson came in at $300,000. Ethan raised his paddle at $350,000. At $400,000, Jacobson dropped. At $450,000, Webb hesitated and then matched. At $500,000, Ethan raised again, and the room did that collective intake of breath that signals a number has crossed a threshold. Webb looked at his wife. His wife looked at the table. Webb set his paddle down. The auctioneer began the countdown. Into the silence of that countdown, a voice from table 8 said, clearly and without hesitation, $550,000. The room turned. Vivian set her paddle down on the table. She had requested the paddle at check-in, a detail no one had anticipated because no one had anticipated her being here, and had held it in her lap through dinner, through Caroline's remarks, through the first 3 auction items, waiting. Patricia, beside her, had gone very still. At table 12, Ethan Callaway had stopped breathing. Sienna Blake had turned in her chair to stare at table 8 with an expression that was trying to decide between bewilderment and something uglier. The auctioneer, a professional who had run enough of these events to understand when a moment was happening, let the silence hold for exactly the right amount of time before speaking. $550,000 from Mrs. Vivian Sterling. Do I have $575? He did not. The countdown resumed. The hammer came down. The room applauded. It was not the frantic applause of a spectacle. It was the specific, slightly stunned applause of a room recalibrating. The sound of 400 people adjusting their understanding of what kind of evening this was, and who exactly was at the center of it. Vivian accepted Patricia's hand on her arm and nodded once, looking at the stage, her expression not triumphant, not performing triumph, which was a different and lesser thing. She looked, if anything, settled, like a woman who had arrived somewhere she had always been heading and found it was, in fact, the right place. Across the room, Janet Hargrove started to clap, and kept clapping slightly longer than necessary, and when her husband Gerald reached for her arm, she moved it away and continued. Ethan was looking at Vivian. The problem behind his eyes was no longer a calculation. It was something else now, something older and less managed, something that had to do with 22 years and a woman he had made the significant error of believing he understood. Sienna said something to him. He didn't turn his head. He was still looking at Vivian. Vivian did not look back. She did not need to. The evening had a long way still to run, and there were pieces still in motion. Monday morning, Thursday's edition, the meeting Caroline had arranged between Vivian and the Foundation's board council that was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following Tuesday. There was the attorney call at 8 on Monday. There was a conversation she still needed to have before the night was over with Gerald Hargrove, who sat on Callaway Capital's board and who she suspected, based on certain patterns in the documentation Richard Cho had assembled, had been signing off on transfers he should not have signed without asking more questions. Gerald, she thought, was going to have a very bad month. But that was tomorrow, and the week after tomorrow, and the long, careful work of consequence. Tonight, for now, was this. The ballroom, the chandelier light, the orchestra starting again with something warm and unhurried, Patricia squeezing her arm once and then releasing it, Caroline at the podium thanking the bidders, her voice carrying that half-smile it had when things had gone better than planned, and Vivian Sterling at table 8, completely present, completely herself, in a room that had spent 4 months deciding she wasn't there. She picked up her champagne glass. She did not toast anyone. She did not make it a gesture. She simply drank. The applause had settled back into the general noise of an event finding its second wind, the post-auction hum of a room that had been charged, and was now releasing that charge through conversation, through the ordering of another drink, through the particular social electricity of people who had witnessed something and were now deciding what to make of it. The orchestra had shifted into something with a waltz tempo, not insistent, just present, filling the air above the tables. Vivian set her champagne glass down and became aware, in the way you become aware of weather changing, that the social atmosphere around her had shifted in a manner that was measurable. 3 people had stopped at table 8 in the 15 minutes since the auction closed who had not previously found reason to visit. Howard Klein, returning from a brief absence, had paused on his way back to his seat to grip Vivian's shoulder once, a brief, wordless contact that communicated more than the words he offered, which were, "Well done." A woman from table 3 named Susan Park, no relation to David, who chaired the Foundation's investment committee, had materialized to say something about the pediatric initiative, which turned into a 5-minute conversation about research funding structures, which Vivian engaged with completely, because she was genuinely interested and because Susan Park was worth knowing better. None of this was accidental. None of it was social coincidence. What Vivian understood, and what the room was currently enacting for anyone paying close enough attention, was the fundamental principle of how social power moved in spaces like this one. It attached to perceived momentum. People gravitated toward whoever looked like they were moving forward. They were not cruel about it, most of them anyway. They were simply responding to a signal, the way a compass needle responded to magnetic north. 4 months ago, the signal had pointed toward Ethan Callaway and his new arrangement, and the room had oriented accordingly. Tonight the signal had shifted, and the room was adjusting, recalibrating, the compass needle swinging. Vivian had understood this for years. She had helped Ethan cultivate it, had stood beside him at events exactly like this one, and worked the room with the patient, precise attention of someone who knew that the actual business of these evenings happened in the 5-minute conversations at the margins, not in the formal program. She had done it for him for 2 decades. She was doing it for herself now. The difference was clarifying. Patricia was watching her from 2 seats away with an expression that mixed admiration with a thread of worry that had been there all evening, visible to Vivian in the way Patricia held her jaw. Patricia worried about the costs of things. It was, generally speaking, one of her better qualities. She had a physician's orientation toward unintended consequences, a habit of asking what happens after the intervention, what the recovery looks like, what the body pays for the treatment. Gerald Hargrove, Patricia said during a brief lull between visitors, in a low voice that didn't carry, has been looking at you for 10 minutes, not at Ethan, at you. Vivian glanced over. Gerald was a heavy-set man of 67, with the permanently cautious expression of someone who had spent 40 years managing other people's risk and had absorbed it into his face. He was at his table, not talking, his wine glass held in both hands in a way that suggested he was using it as something to hold rather than something to drink. "I know," Vivian said. "He looks scared." "He should be," she said. Then, because Patricia deserved more than that, he signed off on 3 of the transfer authorizations. Richard documented it. He may have done it without fully understanding what he was authorizing, or he may have known and looked away. Either way, When this lands, his name is in the paperwork. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Are you going to talk to him tonight? Vivian considered. She had planned to, had thought in the abstract construction of the evening, that a brief exchange with Gerald Hargrove might serve a particular purpose, planting a seed of awareness that would grow into something useful before Monday morning. But looking at him now, at the fear that was visible in the set of his shoulders, she found herself recalculating. Gerald afraid and Gerald aware were not the same thing. Gerald afraid and uninformed might do something erratic. Gerald afraid and informed, given enough information to understand the shape of what was coming, without enough to feel like he could manage it, was a different calculation. Maybe, she said, not yet. At table 12, the blond man in the slightly wrong suit had left. The seat beside Sienna was now occupied by a woman Vivian didn't recognize. Younger, perhaps late 20s, with the specific alert quality of someone who worked for someone else at these events, which is to say a personal assistant or a publicist, someone with a function. Sienna was speaking to her in a low, rapid way, and the woman was nodding and typing something into her phone. Ethan was not at table 12. Vivian scanned the room and found him near the back bar, standing with Marcus Webb, who was doing most of the talking. Ethan had his arms loosely crossed and his drink at his side, and was listening with the expression he wore when someone was telling him something he didn't want to hear but couldn't dismiss. Marcus's hands were moving, small, controlled gestures, the gestures of a man making an argument. Whatever was being said, it had the quality of a reckoning. Marcus Webb had $400 million in a joint venture with Callaway Capital. Vivian had thought about Marcus Webb often in the past few months. She had thought about what it meant that Marcus, who was neither stupid nor careless, had partnered with Ethan on the scale he had. She had thought about whether Marcus knew about the offshore structures, and whether knowing was the same as participating, and where that line was, and whether the distinction would matter to the SEC or to the federal investigators that Margaret had, quietly, already been in contact with. She had decided, eventually, that Marcus Webb was not her concern. That was a determination for people with more enforcement authority than she had. What she did know was that Marcus was a man who protected himself first, and his partnership second, and that a man like that, watching the situation at the bar right now, watching Vivian Sterling bid $550,000 on a foundation initiative while his partner stood at the bar looking like he'd been struck by something, would be making his own calculations. She hoped he was making them fast. The clock on that was shorter than Marcus probably realized. The woman who had been wanting to talk to her for most of the evening arrived at table 8 at 9:23. Her name was Renata Vasquez, and she was 58, a former federal prosecutor who had moved into private practice a decade ago, and who now did the kind of work that sat at the intersection of white-collar law and reputational management, the work that happened when wealthy people needed problems solved that required someone who understood both the legal architecture and the social one. She was 4'11", had always been, and had developed the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades walking into rooms where everyone was taller than her and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. She had known Vivian for 8 years, through the interconnected tissue of philanthropy and legal work that ran through Manhattan's upper-level professional world, and she had called Vivian 6 weeks ago with information that Vivian had not been expecting. The information was that Sienna Blake had been Renata's client. She came to me in August, Renata had said, on that call. She wanted to understand her legal position, whether certain verbal commitments Ethan had made to her were enforceable. What kind of commitments? Vivian had asked. The kind men make when they're trying to close a deal, Renata said, with a flatness that contained a decades-long view of human behavior. Apartment, financial support, the implication of something more permanent without the paperwork. Vivian had thought about that for a moment. And? I declined the representation. Conflict issues, odds. I know you, and I know too much about Callaway's business structures through prior work to be clean, but I thought you should know she'd been looking. Looking for what? Security, Renata said. She's less certain than she performs. Now Renata sat down in the empty seat beside Vivian and said, without preamble, she's trying to figure out what happened tonight. She knows what happened tonight, Vivian said. She's trying to figure out what it means. Her publicist, that's who's sitting with her now, Clarissa Drummond, she does crisis media for half the Upper East Side, has been making calls for the last 40 minutes. Vivian turned to look at Renata directly. How do you know that? Renata's expression did something very small. Clarissa called me 20 minutes ago. She wanted to know if I had any professional knowledge of Vivian Sterling's current legal situation. What did you tell her? I told her I wasn't in a position to discuss client matters, Renata said. Which is true. It also communicated to anyone who knows how that phrase is used that there is something to have knowledge of. Vivian studied her. You came over here to tell me she's making calls. I came over here, Renata said, because I want you to know that whatever she's working on, Sienna and her publicist, is reactive. She's responding to you. You are not responding to her. I want to make sure you're keeping that clearly in mind because the temptation when someone starts making noise is to engage. I'm not going to engage, Vivian said. I know, I'm reminding you anyway. Vivian looked across the ballroom to where Sienna sat, and now she let herself look for more than a glance, let herself observe with the patience she'd cultivated over the last months, the woman who had walked into her marriage and her life with the certainty of someone who had done the math and was sure of the answer. Sienna was beautiful. Vivian had never needed to talk herself into or out of that. She was also, Vivian had concluded over the course of the past months, genuinely unhappy in a way that she probably didn't have words for yet. The calculation she had made, attach herself to Ethan Calloway, leverage his money and his name and his access, replace the boring wife who no longer served his ambitions, was a calculation that made a certain kind of sense if Ethan Calloway were the man he presented himself to be. If he were, in fact, the powerful and stable center of a financial empire that would continue to grow and provide and protect. If he were not, if the empire had structural rot, if the money had been moved in ways that would eventually require accounting for, if the man at the center was about to become the subject of a federal inquiry and a significant piece of business journalism and a divorce settlement that would be decided in a courtroom rather than a quiet negotiation, then the calculation had been made on false premises. Sienna Blake had bet on a house that was already on fire. She just didn't know it yet. And Vivian, who had spent 4 months building the case that would light the match, found, sitting in that ballroom, looking at the woman who had called her irrelevant, that what she felt was not satisfaction exactly. It was something more complicated than satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling you got at the end of a very long piece of work, when the thing you'd built was standing and you could see its shape clearly. Not pride, not vindication, but something that had a physical quality, like exhaling after holding your breath for a long time. She looked away from Sienna. Don't let me get philosophical at galas, she told Renata. It's unbecoming. Renata, who had not witnessed the look but had perhaps inferred it, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You want my advice? Always. Go find Gerald Hargrove, not to say anything specific, just to remind him that you know he exists. She paused. Fear is only useful when the person who's afraid knows you're aware of them. Vivian stood, smoothed her dress once, and went to find Gerald Hargrove. He was no longer at his table. She tracked him to the perimeter of the room near the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over 57th Street, where the city was doing what the city always did, moving, lit, indifferent to the dramas being conducted in the rooms above it. He was standing alone, which was unusual for Gerald at these events. Gerald was a circulator, a natural schmoozer in the old sense, comfortable in the social geometry of these rooms. Standing alone by a window, away from the tables, had the quality of a man seeking an exit that wasn't quite available yet. He saw her coming. She watched him see her, watched the specific quality of his discomfort sharpen, and then, with visible effort, be managed. Vivian, he said, when she was close enough. He shifted his weight, extended his hand. They shook, which felt formal for people who'd attended dozens of events together, but the formality was his doing. Gerald. She stood beside him and looked out the window for a moment at the city. Janet looked well tonight. Yes, good evening. He cleared his throat. We weren't sure you'd be here. I almost wasn't, Vivian said, which was completely untrue but had the texture of honest reflection. But Caroline asked, so. Right. He was looking at the window, not at her. His drink was low. He didn't signal for a refill. Congratulations on the auction. That was generous. The pediatric initiative is good work, she said. A pause. Outside, a line of cars moved down 57th, red taillights, yellow cabs. Gerald, she said, and she kept her voice mild, the way you kept a surface smooth when you were about to say something on it that needed the smoothness. I've been reviewing some things recently, financial things. It's tedious work going through years of documents, but you'd be surprised what you find when you have the time and a good accountant. She did not look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the window. He said nothing, but she could feel the shift in him, the intake of breath that he controlled and released slowly, the new quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of a man looking at a view. I imagine the next few weeks will be busy for a lot of people, she continued, still mild, still looking at the city. Year-end approaches, there's always a great deal of reviewing and adjusting. Boards have their obligations. She tilted her head slightly. How is the Callaway Capital board calendar looking? We have our Q4 review scheduled for... He stopped. He understood she was not asking about the calendar. She finally looked at him. He was looking at her now. The caution in his face had moved into something sharper and harder. And beneath that hardness was something that was, in fact, fear, exactly as Patricia had described. I've always thought you were a careful man, Gerald, she said. It was not quite a compliment, and it was not quite an accusation. It sat precisely between them. I think careful people generally do better when they stay ahead of things rather than behind them. She left him with that. She did not wait for his response, did not give him the opportunity to say anything that she would then have to deal with. She had said what Renata had suggested, had made herself visible to him, had made him aware that she knew he existed in the architecture of what was coming. Whatever Gerald Hargrove chose to do with that awareness was now his problem to manage. Walking back toward table 8, she passed Janet Hargrove, who was standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching the few couples who had taken to it since the orchestra had shifted toward more danceable material. Janet, Vivian said, not stopping, not making it an event. Vivian. Janet turned, and there was a beat, a half second, in which Janet Hargrove did something that required, Vivian suspected, a quiet but genuine act of will. She reached out and touched Vivian's arm, briefly. The bid tonight was extraordinary. Thank you. The work they're doing, the initiative, and it matters. Janet's voice had a quality that suggested she was saying more than the words contained, and that she was aware Vivian understood this, and that both of them had arrived, through the events of the evening, at a point where the performance of ignorance was no longer available. I should have called these last months. I should have. Vivian looked at her. Janet was a woman she had known for 15 years without particularly liking, had respected without warmth, had navigated rather than confided in. This was not a friendship reclaimed, but it was something. It was a strange few months, Vivian said, for everyone. Janet nodded, and that was enough. That was, between two women who understood social economy, a transaction completed, a ledger adjusted. Janet Hargrove had made her calculation, and the calculation had landed where Renata had predicted, on the side of the woman with momentum. Vivian continued walking. She was almost back to table 8 when Sienna Blake appeared in front of her. It was not planned, not on Vivian's plan, anyway. Sienna had moved across the room from table 12 while Vivian was at the windows with Gerald, and had clearly been waiting for this, had positioned herself in the path between the perimeter and table 8, and had done it with enough deliberateness that the women at the adjacent table had noticed and shifted slightly, the way crowds shifted when something was about to happen. They were roughly the same height. Sienna was in ivory and Vivian was in navy, and for a moment they simply stood there, and the room around them did something subtle but real. A reduction in noise, a concentration of attention in their direction, not loud enough to feel like a spectacle, but unmistakable. Sienna had prepared something. Vivian could tell from the quality of her stillness, the specific composure of someone who had rehearsed. I want you to know, Sienna said, her voice low, controlled, that I'm not your enemy. Vivian waited. Whatever you think this is, whatever tonight was for you. Sienna paused, and something in the pause cracked slightly, a seam in the composure that she closed almost immediately. I didn't come into your marriage to hurt you. I know, Vivian said. Sienna seemed briefly thrown. You know? You came into my marriage because Ethan told you a story, Vivian said, and the story sounded like a good bet. She kept her voice matter of fact, not cruel, not kind, just precise. I'm not angry at you, Sienna. I'm not going to pretend tonight was easy to watch, or that the last 4 months were easy to live through. But the problem I have is not with you. Sienna blinked, and there was something that moved across her face, something younger than her 31 years, something underneath the calculation, a surprise that was almost childlike in its quality. She had prepared for hostility and had been handed something else, and she didn't know what to do with it. Then what was tonight? She said, and now her voice had dropped another register, the rehearsed composure mostly gone. What was all of this? Tonight, Vivian said quietly, was the end of a different story. She looked at Sienna steadily. I'd think carefully in the next few weeks about the commitments that have been made to you, whether they're documented, whether the person making them is in a position to keep them. She paused, not as a threat, as the kind of thing a person with your intelligence should be thinking about anyway. Sienna looked at her for a long moment. The room was very quiet around them. Not the whole room, but this corner of it, this small circle of held breath. Why would you tell me that? Sienna said. There was something genuine in it, a real question. Vivian thought about it honestly. Because you called me irrelevant tonight, she said, and I'd like for us to be done with that particular fiction, and because, she stopped, chose the next thing carefully, because I'm not interested in your destruction. I have enough to be interested in. She moved around Sienna and walked back to her table. Patricia was waiting with the expression of someone who had watched the entire exchange from 30 feet away and was struggling to contain it. She managed to wait until Vivian had sat down and picked up her champagne before she said, very quietly, "What did you just do?" "I don't know exactly," Vivian said. It was the most honest thing she'd said all evening. "Was that—" Patricia stopped. "That was kind. What you said to her." "Maybe," Vivian said, "or it was just accurate." The orchestra finished the song it was playing and started something new. Across the room, Sienna Blake had returned to her seat and was sitting with her champagne glass held in both hands, looking at the middle distance with an expression that had lost the performance quality it had carried all evening. She looked like someone who had received information she was trying to fit into a framework that no longer quite held it. Ethan had seen the exchange. Of course he had. He was watching from the bar with Marcus Webb beside him, and his expression had moved from the problem-solving tension she'd observed all evening into something rawer and harder to read, something that had the quality of a man seeing a version of his wife he had either forgotten or never adequately understood. Good, Vivian thought, but she was tired of thinking it. She was tired, actually. Genuinely physically tired in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the length and the weight of the evening. The sustained effort of holding herself at this level of attention for hours, in a room full of people watching her, with stakes she had spent months building. She was 57, and her feet were telling her so, and her back had a specific ache just below the right shoulder blade that always appeared when she'd been holding tension for too long. She thought about the car ride home, about the apartment that was quiet now, the emptiness of it, no longer the particular hollow emptiness of the first weeks, but something more manageable, a spaciousness she was beginning tentatively to think of as hers. She thought about the coffee she would make when she got home, hot this time, and the calls she would have with Margaret in the morning, and the week ahead, which would be the hardest week in months but the last hardest week, she thought, or at least the last one of this particular kind. Patricia leaned close to her. How much longer? As long as it needs, Vivian said. And then, because she was tired and because Patricia was the person who had asked, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, I'll stay. You don't have to. I know, Patricia said. I'm staying. Howard Klein had returned with 2 fresh glasses of champagne that no one had asked for and set them on the table and said, I've been told the Vantage has a remarkable dessert chef. There's a chocolate thing. I've been given descriptions. You're trying to distract me, Vivian said. Aggressively, Howard said. Is it working? She looked at him. This man she hadn't known well enough 2 hours ago, with his dry humor and his jazz knowledge and his easy, uncomplicated kindness. And something in her chest did something brief and complicated that wasn't grief and wasn't quite its opposite, but was something that happened when you'd been running on adrenaline and strategy for a very long time, and someone offered you, without agenda, a chocolate dessert. "Tell me about the chocolate thing," she said. And for the next 20 minutes, that was what they talked about. Around them, the gala continued its work. The orchestra, the movement of people between tables, the slow migration toward exits that would pick up after 10, the conversations accumulating their debts and their investments. Ethan and Marcus Webb had moved from the bar to a corner of the room near the service entrance, their conversation intense and quiet. Sienna Blake had excused herself from table 12 and had not yet returned. Gerald Hargrove was back at his table, talking to his wife, and Janet Hargrove was talking back. And the body language between them had the recognizable quality of a married couple quietly negotiating something they would handle more fully at home. Caroline Blackwood passed Vivian's table just before 10 and rested a hand briefly on her shoulder and said nothing at all, which was, between the two of them, its own complete sentence. David Park had left the reading room and was somewhere in the building, or had possibly already left, carrying in a folded printout in his jacket pocket the documentation that would, in 4 days, rearrange the public understanding of Ethan Callaway's financial architecture. The story was written, or nearly. The sources were confirmed, or nearly. The filing was prepared for Monday, sitting in Margaret O'Sea's office in a sealed folder with a cover note that Vivian had reviewed last Thursday and had asked Margaret to revise once before she was satisfied with the language. The machinery had been built carefully, and it was running, and the only thing left to do for tonight was to be a woman at a gala, finishing her champagne, listening to someone talk about chocolate. That was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The car ride home took 22 minutes. Thomas drove the way he always drove, unhurried, taking the route that avoided the worst of the late-night midtown congestion, the city sliding past the windows in its nighttime configuration of lit windows and empty sidewalks, and the occasional cluster of people outside a restaurant that was still running at full capacity. Vivian sat in the back with her clutch in her lap and her heels off, her feet flat on the floor mat, and said nothing for the first 10 minutes, which Thomas understood and accommodated in the way he accommodated most things, by simply not making it a question. She was going through it in her mind, the sequence of the evening, the things that had landed where she'd intended, and the things that had gone slightly differently. Gerald at the window, the exchange with Sienna, Ethan in the corridor with that look on his face that she was still processing. She was not congratulating herself. She was auditing, the way she always audited after a significant event, looking for the places where the execution had varied from the plan and trying to understand what those variations would mean in the days ahead. The Sienna conversation was the one she kept returning to. She had not planned to speak to Sienna directly. She had planned to maintain the distance she'd maintained all evening, to be visible and composed and untroubled while Sienna watched from across the room. But Sienna had positioned herself, had made the conversation unavoidable, and in the moment, Vivian had said things she had not scripted. Not interested in your destruction. She had meant it when she said it. She believed it still, sitting in the back of the car, feet on the floor mat, city going past. But she was aware that what you meant and what consequences came from your meaning were separate issues. "Thomas," she said. "Mrs. Sterling." He had used that name since she'd mentioned 8 months ago that she was using her maiden name again. He had made the adjustment without comment, without the particular awkward pause that most people inserted when they encountered the change, as though the pause was necessary to acknowledge that something had happened. Thomas had simply updated his language and moved on, and she had been quietly grateful for it ever since. "Thank you for tonight," she said, "for waiting." "Of course," he said. They drove the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of two people who had logged enough hours in this particular vehicle to have moved beyond the necessity of filling it. The apartment was on the 14th floor of a pre-war building on Park Avenue that had been their address, hers and Ethan's, for 16 years. The divorce proceedings had, for the moment, left the question of the apartment unresolved in a state of expensive legal suspension. Ethan had moved into the furnished suite at the Langham 4 months ago, which was not cheap and which he could obviously afford, and Vivian had remained in the apartment because it was technically still her residence, and because Margaret had advised that remaining in place was the correct legal posture during the proceedings. The apartment was large, too large for one person, which she was aware of on some nights more than others. 7 rooms, including the study where she'd spent a substantial portion of the past months working through documents with Richard Cho on video calls, the kitchen where the cold coffee lived, the bedroom that was simply hers now without the particular sensation of something missing, which had taken longer than she'd expected to arrive at. She unlocked the door and went in. The cleaning team had been on Thursday, so the apartment had the specific smell of recently cleaned surfaces and fresh flowers. She'd started buying flowers for herself 6 months ago. A small thing. The kind of small thing that turned out to matter more than its smallness suggested. Tonight's arrangement was yellow and white, sitting on the table in the entrance hall, and she paused for a moment and looked at it and thought, still good. She made the coffee, hot this time. She stood in the kitchen while it brewed and took her earrings off and set them on the counter and rubbed the lobes of her ears where the pressure had accumulated over the course of the evening. And it was such an ordinary gesture, such a specifically unglamorous thing to do at 11:15 after the evening she'd just navigated, that it produced something in her that was close to amusement. She took the coffee to the study and sat at her desk and did not open her laptop. She sat with the coffee in both hands and let the evening be finished. Monday came with cold rain that turned the streets dark and reflective. The kind of November rain that arrived in New York without apology and stayed for days. Vivian was at Margaret's office by 8, which meant she had been awake since 5:30, which was not unusual. Sleep had been irregular for months, not the miserable insomnia of the early weeks when she'd spent long hours staring at the ceiling doing calculations she already knew the answers to, but a lighter disruption, her mind coming alert at odd hours with items for the list that was never quite finished. Margaret Osie's office occupied a floor of a building in Midtown that looked, from the outside, like every other Midtown office building, and inside was a study in controlled, understated competence, clean surfaces, good light, the kind of furniture that communicated substance without effort, and on Margaret's desk, always a single yellow legal pad that she wrote on by hand in a script so small and precise that Vivian had once asked about it. Margaret had said, "I've always thought more carefully when I write it down." Something about the slowness of it. Margaret was 59, had been practicing for 31 years, and had the quality that Vivian had most needed in the months of building this case. She was not impressed by anything. Not by the money involved, not by the social weight of the names, not by the complexity of the offshore structures, not by the fact that they were, effectively, preparing to detonate a significant portion of New York's financial and social infrastructure around a man who had spent 2 decades cultivating his position in both. She approached it all as technical problems requiring methodical solutions, and when she expressed concern, it was measured and specific and worth heeding. "The filing goes in at 9, Margaret said, without preamble, as Vivian sat down. The yellow pad was already covered in her small script. "Any issues overnight?" Vivian asked. "Ethan's attorney contacted my office at 7:15 this morning." Margaret set her pen down. "They're requesting an emergency call." Vivian felt something shift in her chest. Not alarm, but the physical sensation of a timeline accelerating. "He knows." "Something has moved," Margaret said carefully. Whether he knows about the SEC filing specifically, or whether someone in his circle has made enough calls over the weekend to give him a general picture, I can't say. But the call request was marked urgent, and his lead attorney, Forsyth, doesn't use that word unless he means it. "What do you want to do with it?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "I want to file at 9, as planned. After that files, the conversation shifts entirely. Anything we discuss with their side is post-filing, and the framework changes. If we take the call before 9, we're potentially giving them information we're not obligated to give, and we're letting them set the terms of this morning's conversation." She paused. "What I don't want is for you to feel like you're making decisions at speed. So I'm asking what you think." Vivian thought about Ethan in the corridor at the Vantage, that look on his face when she'd come out of the reading room. Something's different. She thought about the weekend, which she had spent at home working through the final review of documents with Richard on a Saturday call, and then Sunday in a deliberate act of normalcy. A walk in the park in the cold rain, lunch with Patricia, an evening reading a novel she'd been meaning to start for 3 months. She had been quiet. She had expected noise and there had been none. and the silence from Ethan's side over the weekend had not felt like peace. It had felt like the specific silence of a man making calls he didn't want traced. "File at 9, she said. Margaret nodded once, picked up her pen, and made a note. The call from Forsyth's office goes to voicemail until 10. At 9:02, Margaret's paralegal confirmed the filing. Margaret turned her computer screen so Vivian could see the confirmation number. Vivian looked at it for a moment. A string of digits on a government filing system that represented, in the most abstract sense, the point of no return, and felt nothing dramatic, just a kind of settling, like ground that had been soft and was finally firm underfoot. "It's in," Margaret said. "Yes," Vivian said. They spent the next 90 minutes going through the protocols for the days ahead. When Forsyth called back, what to say and what not to say. The statement Margaret's office would release at noon, carefully worded and brief, confirming that a filing had been made and that Mrs. Sterling's legal team was cooperating fully with the relevant authorities. The call with Richard Cho at 2 to review the documentation inventory one final time before it was submitted as part of the evidentiary package. The board notification process for the Blackwood Foundation, which Caroline had already initiated through her own counsel. At 10:07, Margaret took Forsyth's call on speaker. Robert Forsyth had been Ethan Calloway's primary attorney for 9 years, which meant he had been, for those 9 years, an occasional presence in Vivian's peripheral life, a voice on speakerphone at the end of a long dinner table during certain financial negotiations, a figure at a conference table twice during contract discussions that Vivian had been present for as a formality. He was 62, a name partner at a firm with 3 floors of Rockefeller Center, and he had a voice that was trained for authority, measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who understood that the person who controlled the pace of a conversation controlled its outcome. "Margaret," he said, "I appreciate you returning this morning." "Of course, Robert. What can I do for you?" "I'm calling because my client is prepared to discuss a revised settlement framework that he believes would be in the interests of all parties." A pause. "My understanding is that there have been some recent legal actions that may affect the landscape here, and we'd prefer to resolve the civil matters in an environment that's productive for both sides." Margaret looked at Vivian. Vivian gave the smallest shake of her head. "I appreciate that, Robert," Margaret said. "I'm not in a position to discuss settlement framework at this point. We have active proceedings, and our focus is on those proceedings. If your client has a formal proposal, please submit it in writing to this office." A beat. "Is Mrs. Calloway—" "Mrs. Sterling," Margaret said without inflection. "Mrs. Sterling available to speak?" "She is not," Margaret said. "Written proposal, Robert. We'll review it in due course." She ended the call. The room was quiet for a moment. "He's scared," Margaret said. It was not a triumphant observation. She said it the way a physician said the fever has broken, as clinical information. "He should be," Vivian said. Then, "How long before Forsyth starts recommending that Ethan cooperate with the SEC?" "If Ethan is smart," Margaret considered. "Before the end of the week. Forsyth has been in this business long enough to know what happens to clients who fight an SEC action with incomplete information." She tilted her head slightly. "Whether Ethan follows that recommendation is a different question. Ethan is not always smart in the ways that matter." That was, Vivian thought, one of the most precise things Margaret had ever said about the man she'd been married to for 22 years, and it arrived with the strange intimacy of something that was completely accurate and also, in some minor key, sad. Not the devastating sadness of the early months, not the grief of a marriage ending, but something smaller and more specific. The particular sorrow of seeing a person clearly after a long time of imprecision, and finding that clarity confirmed something you had been trying not to know. Ethan was not always smart in the ways that mattered. He had been brilliant in certain channels. The instinct for a deal, the ability to read a room for its financial possibilities, the particular charisma that made other men want to be in his orbit and brought their capital with them. She had admired those qualities genuinely. She had built a life with them. But intelligence in one domain was not intelligence in all domains, and the domain in which Ethan had been most consequentially unintelligent was in his understanding of the people closest to him, a failure of curiosity or empathy or some combination of the two that had allowed him, for years, to move through the architecture of his private life as if the people in it were furniture, arranged for his comfort, not expected to rearrange themselves. He had looked at his wife for 2 decades and seen what she allowed him to see and not looked further. And she, it had to be said, had allowed that. For a long time she had allowed it. She was not allowing it anymore. She left Margaret's office at noon and went to lunch alone at a small Italian place 3 blocks away that she'd been going to for years, where the owner knew her order and the tables were far enough apart that conversations didn't carry. She ate pasta and drank sparkling water and read 40 pages of the novel she'd started Sunday, and she did not look at her phone except once, at 12:47, when Patricia sent a text that said, "Call me when you're out of the office world. Thinking of you." To which Vivian sent back, "Lunch, novel, pasta, fine." And Patricia sent, "Good with a period," which from Patricia meant genuine relief. The world outside the Italian restaurant was moving. She could feel it even from inside this quiet room, the particular hum of consequence in motion, wheels she had set turning that were now turning on their own momentum. David Park was writing. Margaret's statement was going out. Richard's documentation was compiling. Caroline's board counsel was making calls. Gerald Hargrove was, she was fairly certain, having a conversation with his own attorney today that he had not planned to have this week. And somewhere in all of that, Ethan Calloway was sitting with Forsyth in a conference room above Rockefeller Center, or on the phone from the Langham suite, or pacing the distance between the window and the desk that men like him paced when the structure of their certainty was being examined with instruments they hadn't anticipated. She ordered dessert, which she almost never did at lunch, and ate it without hurry and went back to her novel. Thursday arrived the way David Park's stories always arrived, cleanly and without warning for people who hadn't been waiting for it. The piece ran in the morning edition under a headline that was specific and factual. Callaway Capital, SEC. Filing alleges systematic asset concealment. Investors seek answers. It was thorough, well-sourced, and written in the measured style David used for his most serious work. Not sensational, which made it more damaging than sensational would have been. Sensational gave people something to push back on, a tone to criticize, a heat to deflect. This was cold. This was documented. This named figures and dates and account numbers and the names of shell companies and the name of the Delaware holding and the gap in the Meridian Partners transaction record that had now been filled, and it quoted Richard Cho by name and title and credential. Vivian read it at 6:20 in the morning at her kitchen table with a cup of actual hot coffee. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the table and sat with her hands wrapped around the mug and looked at the kitchen she'd lived in for 16 years. The pale marble counters, the copper pots she'd bought at a market in Paris 11 years ago on a trip that had been one of the last genuinely uncomplicated times in the marriage. The small framed print on the wall beside the window that she'd chosen and he'd said was too small for the space, and she'd hung it anyway and been right. Her phone began vibrating. She turned it over. Patricia. She let it go to voicemail and texted, "I'll call in an hour. I'm fine." Then she turned it face down again and had her coffee. The calls that arrived in the hours after the story broke had a taxonomy that Vivian found instructive. The first tier were the people she'd expected. Her attorney, Margaret, at 7:05 with a business-like summary of the calls her office had already received. Richard Cho, 7:22, confirming that the SEC had made contact as anticipated and that he was prepared. Patricia. She eventually took this one at 7:45, a 15-minute conversation that was mostly Patricia saying, "Are you okay in 7 different configurations?" and Vivian saying yes in ways that she hoped communicated the specific texture of the yes, which was complicated but genuine. Her brother James called from Boston, which surprised her. They were not close and spoke infrequently, but James had apparently seen the story and felt the pull of family in a moment that had the shape of crisis, and she was moved by the call in a way that she hadn't anticipated. They talked for 20 minutes about things other than the story, mostly, and she promised to visit in the spring. The second tier were the people who called to perform concern that was actually something else. Curiosity dressed as sympathy, or social anxiety dressed as support. The instinct to be adjacent to a significant event in a way that could be recalled later. Vivian did not take most of these calls. She was not unkind about it. She was simply busy. The third tier were the professional calls, investors and board members and various figures in the financial and philanthropic world who were now, with the efficiency of people who operated at the intersection of money and reputation, recalibrating their positions. 3 of these calls she took herself. The others she routed to Margaret. What she did not receive that morning was a call from Ethan. She had not expected one, exactly, but she had been aware of the possibility, had held a space for it in her thinking, and when Thursday moved through its morning hours without his number appearing on her screen, she felt a complicated mixture of relief and something that was older and harder to categorize. 22 years was a long time. The absence of a call was not surprising, but absence and insignificance were different things. What she received instead, at 11:40, was a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of a call with Margaret's paralegal about a document request, but something made her look at the number again. A 212 area code, but not a number in her contacts, and she interrupted the paralegal briefly and switched. "Vivian Sterling," she said. A pause. Then, "It's Sienna." The pause that followed this was Vivian's, a brief recalibration as she placed the voice and understood what she was holding. "How did you get this number?" she said. Not hostile, just asking. "Clarissa," Sienna said. "Clarissa Drummond, the publicist. She has numbers for... She collects numbers. I'm sorry to call without..." She stopped. There was a quality in her voice that Vivian hadn't heard at the gala, a texture beneath the words that was less constructed. "I know this is probably the last thing you want. What do you need, Sienna?" A longer pause. Vivian could hear faintly traffic on the other end. Sienna was outside or near an open window. "I've been trying to reach Ethan since yesterday afternoon. His phone goes to voicemail. His office says he's unavailable. I went to the Langham this morning and they told me he'd checked out." Vivian said nothing. "He moved out of the Langham," Sienna said, and now the construction in her voice was fully gone, and what was left was the sound of a 31-year-old woman who had made a bet and was beginning to understand the scale of what she'd lost. I don't know where he is. His attorney's office told me to stop calling. There were things he told me, things he promised, and I don't..." She stopped again. Vivian closed her eyes for a moment. She had told her at the gala, not as a threat. She'd meant that when she said it. "Think carefully about the commitments that have been made to you, whether they're documented." She had told her because it was accurate, and because accuracy, even when it was uncomfortable, was the thing she had to offer. She had not told her because she had expected it to land in time to matter. "Sienna," she said, "I'm not going to tell you where Ethan is. I don't know where he is." She kept her voice level. "What I will tell you is this. Get your own attorney. Not through him, not anyone he's recommended. Your own, completely separate. Call them today." I don't have..." A small stop. "The apartment he put me in is in a corporate name. I found that out this morning. I called the building manager. My name isn't on anything." Vivian did not say "I know," because that would have required explanation. "Get an attorney," she said again. "Today. Whatever you think you're owed, whatever was promised to you. That conversation happens through attorneys, not through him and not through me." "Why are you telling me this?" The question was the same one from the gala, the same real confusion. Vivian thought about it honestly, the way she had the first time. "Because he did this to you too," she said. "He just used a different story." She heard Sienna breathe. "Get the attorney." She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, in her kitchen, in the apartment that had been half his and was now entirely hers, with the copper pots and the small print on the wall and the November light coming through the window at the low angle it came at this time of year. The coffee was cold again. She didn't drink it. She thought about what it meant to be right about a person, to have known or suspected or finally confirmed that the man you'd shared your life with had a capacity for a particular kind of carelessness toward people he had decided were no longer useful. She had been on the receiving end of that carelessness. Sienna was on the receiving end of it now, with less history and fewer resources and no preparation. She was not Sienna Blake's advocate. She did not have the emotional bandwidth to be Sienna Blake's advocate, and she was honest enough with herself about that to not dress it up as something else. But she had told her the true thing, twice, and the true thing was, get your own attorney. Everything else followed from that. She called Margaret back. "I have a sidebar," she said when Margaret answered. "Unrelated to our proceedings." Margaret waited. "There's a woman who may need a referral," Vivian said. "Someone independent, not connected to any of the Callaway business. Family law. Good one." A brief pause. Margaret was not the kind of attorney who asked unnecessary questions. "I can send you 2 names, please. Do you want me to ask why?" Vivian thought about the traffic sounds in the background of Sienna's call, the constructed voice come completely apart. "No," she said. "I think I know why." The names arrived 20 minutes later in a text. Vivian forwarded them with 2 lines of context to Sienna's number. She did not add anything else. She was not starting a correspondence. She was not building a relationship. She was closing a loop that had been open since the gala, and the closing felt right, not dramatically right, not in the way that made a story, but in the smaller and more durable way of things done because they were accurate. She spent the afternoon at her desk. The professional calls continued. By 3 o'clock, 2 of the Callaway Capital Limited partners had issued brief statements through their communications teams indicating that they were reviewing their positions. Marcus Webb's office had not issued a statement of any kind, which Margaret's assistant noted, and which Margaret said, in the flat tone she used when information was self-explanatory, meant that Marcus was in conversation with his own attorneys about his exposure. At 4:15, Ethan's attorney Forsyth issued a statement on behalf of Ethan personally. It was 3 sentences. It expressed that Ethan took these matters seriously, was cooperating with the appropriate authorities, and was committed to resolving all pending matters appropriately. It did not deny the substance of David Park's reporting. It was, Margaret told Vivian in a message, the statement of a man whose attorney had told him what the statement of a man cooperating with investigators looked like, and had written it accordingly. Vivian read the statement twice and felt the same thing she'd felt at 9:02 Monday morning when the filing confirmed. A settling. A firmness underfoot. She had not built this to destroy him. She had built it because he had tried to take what was not his to take. Her financial future, her position, her name's worth in a world she had helped construct. And she had refused to let him. The destruction, to the extent it was happening, was the natural consequence of choices he had made across 3 years of moving money he was not entitled to move and treating the people in his life as positions on a ledger. She had just been the one who did the accounting. At 5 o'clock, she closed her laptop and called Patricia. "The 4 o'clock news ran it," Patricia said before Vivian could speak. "I know. Are you okay? And I mean actually, not the 5-word version." Vivian looked at the window, the November light finally giving out at the end of the afternoon, the city moving into the blue dark of early evening. The copper pots. The small print. The flowers in the entrance hall that would need to be replaced by Saturday. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm genuinely tired." Good tired or bad tired? She thought about it. The kind of tired where you finish something that needed finishing. She paused. "I need a week where nothing significant happens." "That's not coming," Patricia said, not unkindly. "Next week is—" "I know what next week is." The depositions. The continued SEC process. The settlement negotiations that would restart in a new key now that the filing had changed the landscape. The apartment question. The questions about what came after, which were questions she had not yet fully let herself open. "I know, but I'm going to pretend for tonight that next week is very far away." "What are you doing tonight?" "Cooking," Vivian said. It came out simply, without the quality of a statement. "Actual cooking, not reheating something." "What?" "I don't know yet. Whatever's in the kitchen." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That sounds exactly right," she said. And it was. The pasta she made that Thursday evening was imperfect in the specific way that cooking alone always was. Too much for one person, slightly oversalted, the sauce catching on the bottom of the pan for 30 seconds before she caught it. She ate it at the kitchen table with a glass of red wine and the novel she'd been carrying around for 3 days, and she read 20 pages that she would barely remember the next morning, and the apartment was quiet in the way it had learned to be quiet around her rather than empty at her. That distinction had taken months to arrive. She was glad it had. The weeks that followed the gala and the filing and the Thursday story were not simple. She had told Patricia that she needed a week where nothing significant happened. and she had known when she said it that no such week was coming, and she had been correct. What came instead was the sustained, grinding, thoroughly unglamorous work of consequence. The legal machinery that she had set in motion now running at full speed and requiring her presence, her attention, her signature, her memory, and on several occasions her considerable restraint. The SEC process moved faster than Margaret had predicted, which Margaret attributed to the quality of the documentation Richard had assembled, and to the fact that at least two of Callaway Capital's limited partners had, upon reviewing their own exposure in the wake of David Park's story, decided that cooperation was the prudent posture and had submitted their own materials to the investigators. Gerald Hargrove was among them. She had not been surprised. She had sat in Margaret's conference room when Margaret told her, looked at the yellow legal pad and thought about Gerald at the window of the Vantage Hotel, looking at the city with his drink held in both hands, and she had thought, there it is. Gerald had made the calculation she expected him to make, the calculation of a careful man who understood that being ahead of a problem was categorically different from being buried by it. What Vivian had not expected was the call from Gerald himself. It came on a Tuesday morning, the second week after the gala, while she was at her desk working through a document review. She stared at his name on her screen for 3 rings before answering. "Gerald," she said. "Vivian." His voice had the quality of a man who had rehearsed an opening and was now doing the harder work of actually using it. "I want you to know that I've been in contact with the SEC. My attorney submitted materials yesterday." "I heard," she said. A silence. "I want to say—" He stopped. "What I signed off on. I want to tell you that I didn't know the full picture. I want to say that, and I want you to know that I understand you have no particular reason to believe it." Vivian looked at the window. The November rain was still at it, patient and indifferent. "Why are you calling me, Gerald?" "Not Margaret, me." Another pause. Longer this time, the kind that had actual thinking in it. "Because you built this," he said finally. "Because you were the one who saw it and did something about it, and I was the one sitting at a table signing things I should have looked at harder, and I think—" He cleared his throat. "I think that deserved a direct acknowledgement, not through attorneys." She had not expected that. She found she didn't have an immediate response to it, which was unusual for her. "Thank you, Gerald," she said eventually. It was not absolution. She did not offer absolution, and he had not asked for it. But it was what she had, and it was real. "Janet sends her regards," he said, as though he needed something to close the call with. "Tell her I'll call her for lunch," Vivian said. "Next month, when things are less—" "Yes," Gerald said. "Of course." They ended the call, and Vivian sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment, in the way she sometimes did when something unexpected had moved through her, and the residue needed a second to settle. People were complicated. She had always known this. Gerald Hargrove was a man who had looked away from things he should have examined, which was a failure, but he was also a man who, when the reckoning came, had made a choice that required something, and had then called the person he owed a direct acknowledgement to make it directly. That did not erase the first thing, but it coexisted with it. People were complicated, and the story she was living was not a simple one with clean villains and clean heroes, and she had known that going in. She had built her case on facts, not on the narrative convenience of Ethan Callaway being purely monstrous and herself being purely wronged. He had done specific, documented, legally actionable things. She had done something about them. The moral landscape around all of it was more intricate than any version of the story that was being told in the press, and she was the only one who had to live inside that intricacy without simplifying it. That was fine. Simplicity had never been her strong suit. The settlement negotiations resumed in the 3rd week of November, in a new key, as Margaret had predicted. Forsyth came to the table with numbers that would have been unimaginable in the framework of the original prenuptial agreement. The agreement that subsection 14C had voided in its entirety, a fact that Forsyth had clearly and fully briefed his client on, because the numbers he brought reflected a man who understood that the ground had shifted and that fighting the shift was going to cost more than accommodating it. Vivian sat across the conference table from Forsyth. Ethan was not present, which was standard, the negotiation conducted through representatives, and listened to Margaret work with the careful, systematic precision that had made her one of the top 3 divorce attorneys in the city for a decade. The negotiation lasted 3 sessions over 2 weeks. It was not pleasant. Nothing about the specific arithmetic of dismantling a 22-year marriage was pleasant, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of who had built what and who had taken what and who was now accounting for it. There were moments in those sessions when the sheer accumulated weight of 2 decades expressed itself as a specific kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the legal strategy and everything to do with being human. She did not break down in any of those sessions. She also did not behave as though she were made of stone, which she was not, and which performing would have required more energy than she had available. There was a moment in the second session during a discussion of the Paris apartment, a small property they had bought together in the 7th arrondissement, one of the last things they had done together that felt, in the moment, like it was for them and not for the architecture of a public life. When she said, mid-sentence, "I'd like a moment," and stood up and walked to the window and looked at the street below for 90 seconds and came back and continued. Margaret did not comment. Forsyth did not comment. They simply waited. That was the hardest 90 seconds of the entire process. She kept the Paris apartment. The final settlement was reached in the second week of December, on a Wednesday afternoon, when the short winter daylight was already fading at 4 o'clock, and the city outside Margaret's windows had gone into its early dark mode. Margaret called Vivian at 4:47 and said, "It's done." And Vivian said, "Okay." And they sat on the phone in silence for a moment before Margaret said, in a departure from her usual precision, "You did well, Vivian, genuinely." "You did the work," Vivian said. "We both did," Margaret said. "That's true. But you built the foundation. The rest of it was possible because of that." Vivian set the phone down on her desk and looked at the room. Her study, her desk, her books, the small lamp she'd had since graduate school that cast a particular orange light over everything and that she'd kept through every apartment, every move, every reconfiguration of her life, a continuous thread. She had done her dissertation in the light of that lamp, 24 years old, and convinced that she had the whole shape of her future clearly in mind. She had gotten some of it right and a great deal of it wrong and had survived both. She was still here. That seemed, in the moment, like the most important thing. The SEC investigation continued into the new year. These things did not resolve in weeks, and Vivian had known going in that the legal consequence for Ethan would be a longer story than the civil settlement, slower moving and more procedural and outside her direct involvement. She cooperated with the investigators when asked, submitted documentation through Margaret's office, answered questions in a deposition that ran 4 hours on a January morning and left her with a headache that lasted 2 days. She followed the progress of the investigation through Margaret and through the occasional story that David Park published as new information became available. In late January, Callaway Capital suspended operations pending the outcome of the federal investigation. In February, Ethan reached a cooperation agreement with the SEC that Margaret's sources indicated involved substantial financial penalties and a prohibition from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 7 years. Criminal referral was still under consideration as of the last update Vivian had received, a legal determination that was not hers to influence or control. Marcus Webb had, as she'd suspected he might, submitted his own cooperation materials in December. The joint venture was unwound. Marcus's statement to the investigators was thorough enough, according to what filtered back through various channels, to suggest that he had known more than he should have and had been calculating his options since before the gala. These were facts she held without particular satisfaction, in the way you held the outcome of a process you had set in motion, aware of it, present to it, but not living inside it. The case had been built and the building was done, and what the machinery produced from here was outside her hands. She had learned in the months of doing this that there was a specific relief in letting things leave your hands once they were finished. You did not have to carry the outcome of everything you set in motion. You just had to set it in motion carefully. The question she had been not quite opening since the gala, the question of what came after, presented itself fully, with no more proceedings to hide behind, in the early weeks of the new year. It was not a romantic question. She was not looking for that, had not been looking for that, had felt, if anything, a deep-bodied indifference to the idea in the months since the marriage had formally ended, an indifference that she had examined with some care and decided was not damage, but was simply the natural state of a woman who had more immediate and interesting things to think about. Patricia had raised the subject once, obliquely, in the careful way Patricia raised things she expected resistance to, and Vivian had said, "Not now, and honestly, maybe not for a long while, and I'm completely fine with that." Patricia had assessed her with the diagnostic attention of an oncologist looking for something she hoped not to find, and had apparently found nothing, and had said, "Okay," and had not raised it again. What the question was larger than that. It was the question of who she was going to be now. Not who the divorce had made her, not who the case had made her, but who she had the opportunity to become. Now that the long work of dismantling and protecting and building the case was finished, and she was standing in the cleared space of her own life with more room than she'd had in years. She sat with that question for the first 2 weeks of January without trying to answer it, which was its own kind of discipline. She had spent 4 months moving toward a specific objective, and the inclination, once the objective was achieved, was to immediately construct another one, to fill the cleared space with plans and structures and the next version of the architecture. She resisted this. She had earned the unclear space. She intended to occupy it honestly before deciding what to build in it. What she knew, at the start of the new year, was a set of things that felt solid. She had the apartment, which was hers now in a way it hadn't been before, not just legally, but fundamentally, every room calibrated to her own presence. She had the settlement, which gave her financial independence of a scope she had not fully permitted herself to imagine during the years of building it. She had Margaret in her corner for the ongoing matters. She had Richard Cho, who had called her in January to say he was retiring in the spring, and she was the finest client he'd had in 10 years, which she suspected was not something he said to everyone, but which she appreciated regardless. She had Patricia, who texted her on Thursday mornings without fail, and showed up at her door with food when Vivian forgot to eat in the way that she sometimes did during periods of sustained stress. She had Howard Klein, who had called in December to ask if she'd like to attend a jazz performance at a small venue in the village. Not a date, he'd been clear, just 2 people who'd discovered a shared interest over a chocolate dessert discussion. And she had said yes, and they had gone, and she had come home with her ears full of music and felt, for the first time in a long time, uncomplicated pleasure. And she had Caroline Blackwood, who called her on a Thursday in late January and said, "I want to discuss the foundation board. We have an opening." Vivian had been sitting in her kitchen with her second coffee of the morning. "Caroline, you've sat on 3 boards in the past decade," Caroline said, in the direct way of a 71-year-old woman who had stopped preambulating. "You understand nonprofit finance at a level most board members don't. You understand the intersection of social and financial capital. You have, as of recently, a particular credibility in conversations about institutional accountability that is relevant to us." A pause. "I'm not asking as a favor. I'm asking because I think you're the right person." Vivian set her coffee down. "I'd want to understand the scope of the position before I... Of course, lunch, next week. I'll have the materials sent over beforehand." "Caroline," Vivian said, "why now? Specifically, now?" A silence that had something thoughtful in it. "Because," Caroline said, "a year ago you were a woman that people were writing out of their own narratives, and now you're a woman that a room of 400 people watched with their absolute attention." She paused. "That's not just social capital, Vivian. That's moral authority. And the foundation needs people with moral authority. It has enough people with money." Vivian thought about the gala, the chandelier, table 8, the bid, Sienna's voice at the east side of the room, and found that the memory of it had settled into something less charged than it had been in the weeks immediately following. It had been the sharpest night of the past year, but it was not the whole story. It was the night that visible things became visible. Everything before and after, it was the actual substance. "Send the materials," she said. "Tuesday," Caroline said. "And Vivian, the pediatric initiative will be formally named next month. I wanted you to know before the announcement." "Named for whom?" "You'll see," Caroline said, with the serenity of a woman who had been arranging surprises for 71 years and had gotten very good at it. She would see. That was enough for now. On a Saturday in early February, a bright cold day with the kind of hard, clear light that New York sometimes produced in winter, the kind that made everything look like it had edges. Vivian walked from the apartment south through the park. She wore her coat and her good walking shoes, and she did not listen to anything through earbuds, just walked in the cold air with her hands in her pockets and the city around her in its Saturday configuration of people doing the various ordinary things that constituted a life. She thought about the 22 years. Not with the anxious, recalculating quality that had characterized her thinking during the months of building the case, but with something more settled, more like witnessing than reviewing. She had been 25 and in love with a man who was ambitious and charming and who saw in her something he valued in the way some men valued things, which was to say intensely and incompletely. She had brought things to the marriage that she had not always been given credit for, and some of which she had not always given herself credit for. She had looked away from things, at various points, that she should have looked at sooner. She had also built something real, not just the case and the settlement and the work of this past year, but the 20 years before it, the actual substance of a life, the knowledge of how rooms worked, how money moved, how people made their decisions in the social and financial ecologies she had inhabited for 2 decades. None of that went away when a marriage ended. It became hers more completely. She had been complicit in her own erasure for a while. She could see that now in the clear-edged February light without the defensive distortion that would have accompanied the admission a year ago. She had allowed herself to be shelved because some part of her had believed, for longer than she should have, that the shelf was where she belonged, that the public face and the financial ambitions were his domain and the architecture beneath them was hers, and that this arrangement was sustainable and perhaps even equitable. It was not equitable. She had known this and had not acted on the knowing, and that was her part of the accounting. But she had acted eventually. She had seen clearly and had acted with precision and patience, and the result was not triumph in the cinematic sense, not a single dramatic moment of reversal, but something more durable. It was the cleared space, the apartment on a Saturday morning, the board position she hadn't yet accepted but would, the jazz she'd heard in December still somewhere in her body. The lunch with Caroline on Tuesday. Her brother's voice on the phone asking her to come to Boston in the spring. The simple, irreducible fact of being a woman who had been written out and had rewritten herself. She stopped near the reservoir where the path curved and you could see if the day was clear enough all the way to the skyline above the tree line in the direction of Midtown. It was clear enough today. She stood there for a minute and looked at it. The city she had lived in for 26 years, that had never stopped being itself regardless of what she was going through, that was doing its millions of lives thing right now, completely indifferent to the fact that she was standing here having arrived somewhere. She thought about something she had said to Margaret months ago when Margaret had asked why the gala mattered, why the specific public setting, why the timing, why she hadn't simply filed and let the legal process run. She had said, because he needed to see me in the room before he understood that I had never left it. Standing at the reservoir in the February light, she revised that slightly. It had been true, and the gala had served the purpose she'd designed it for. But the deeper truth was that she had needed to be in the room, not for him, not for the Sienna Blakes or the Gerald Hargroves or the Janet Hargroves recalibrating their positions, for herself. She had needed to walk into that room alone, in a dress that fit her like a decision, and be seen, not as someone's wife, not as a woman in retreat, but as herself, complete, a person who had been underestimated for a specific period of time and was done accommodating that underestimation. Visibility, she had learned, was not vanity. Sometimes it was simply the act of refusing to be disappeared. She pulled her coat closer and started walking again. Patricia called at noon as she was coming back up Park Avenue. "Tell me you've eaten something," Patricia said. "Coffee." "Vivian." "I'm on my way back. I'll eat." "There's a place that opened on 82nd, Patricia said. "Turkish. A friend went last week and apparently the food is extraordinary. You have nothing on your calendar today. I know because you told me last week you were keeping Saturday clear." Vivian smiled at the sidewalk. "Are you suggesting lunch or are you checking on me?" "Both," Patricia said without apology. "Can it be both?" "It can be both," Vivian said. 82nd. What time?" 12:30, Patricia said. "I'm already walking." Of course she was. They ate for 2 hours. The food was, in fact, extraordinary, a fact that Howard Klein would have noted with vindication had she told him about it, which she probably would. And they talked about Patricia's work, about a case Patricia had been troubled by for weeks, about James and the spring trip to Boston that Vivian was beginning to plan in the loosest sense. They talked about the foundation board position, which Patricia said was the right thing without qualification. They talked about the Paris apartment, which Vivian had not yet visited since the settlement, but was thinking about going to in April, alone, which felt important for reasons she hadn't fully articulated. Alone? Patricia said. Alone, Vivian said. Patricia considered it. Good, she said. Go alone first, then invite people. That was, Vivian thought, exactly right. At some point in the second hour, Patricia said, "Are you happy? Not in the big philosophical sense, just right now. Sitting here." Vivian looked at the table, the remnants of the meal, the bread that was still warm, the tea Patricia had ordered that was the color of dark amber. The restaurant was busy in the easy Saturday way, full of people doing the ordinary fundamental thing of sitting together and eating and talking, the vast, unremarkable fabric of a city being lived in. "Yes," she said, and then, because Patricia deserved the more complete version, "Not the way I thought happiness was supposed to look, maybe, but yes." "What did you think it was supposed to look like?" Vivian thought about it honestly. "More certain," she said, "more finished." She turned her teacup in her hands. "I think I spent a lot of years waiting for a version of my own life that felt settled enough. And this doesn't feel settled. There are 100 things unresolved. The investigation is still running. The board position isn't confirmed. I don't know what April in Paris looks like or what I'm building after it." She paused. "But I'm here. I'm completely here, in a way I don't think I've been in years. And that feels like the actual thing, not the settled version. This." Patricia looked at her across the table for a long moment, with the diagnostic attention, and this time what she found in it seemed to be what she was looking for, because something in her face relaxed. "Good," she said, "just that," and reached across and briefly covered Vivian's hand with her own, and then picked up her tea. They split the check. They walked north together for 2 blocks before Patricia turned east toward her own building and Vivian continued north. They did not make it a moment, did not extend the goodbye beyond what it naturally was. 2 women parting after lunch on a Saturday, arranging Thursday loosely, the ordinary grammar of a friendship that had been going long enough not to require ceremony. Vivian walked the last 6 blocks home alone. The cold had eased slightly in the afternoon, the hard-edged light softening toward 4 o'clock. The sky doing the thing it sometimes did in February, where the blue went so deep and clear it looked almost like a different season. She thought about the question Sienna had asked her twice. "Why would you tell me that?" The first time at the gala, the second on the phone. She had answered honestly both times, but the honest answer was different in the light of February than it had been in October. What she had wanted to tell Sienna, what she had been unable to say in either of those moments, without it sounding like something it wasn't, was this. The only thing she knew with any certainty about navigating the specific kind of difficulty she had navigated was that clarity was worth more than anything. Not the pretense of clarity, not the performed certainty of a woman who had everything arranged, but the actual thing. The capacity to see what was in front of you, accurately, without the distortions of fear or vanity or the need to maintain a story that was no longer true. She had not had that clarity for years in her marriage. She had looked away from things she should have examined, smoothed over things she should have questioned, performed contentment past the point where the performance was useful or honest. And then something had shifted, slowly and then not slowly. And she had made herself look at 57 years old with the patience of someone who understood that looking clearly was not the same as moving fast. And she had seen what was there. That was what she had wanted to tell Sienna. Not, "He's terrible," and not, "I won," and not any version of one woman's triumph over another woman's calculation. Just look clearly at what is in front of you. Do it early if you can. It costs less that way. Whether Sienna had used the attorney referrals, Vivian didn't know. She had not heard from her again, which was appropriate, and which she had no desire to change. Whatever Sienna Blake was building from what remained of the situation she'd walked into, that was hers to navigate. Vivian had offered what she had to offer. The rest was Sienna's work. Everyone had their own reckoning. Everyone had their own version of the moment when what had been arranged around you stopped working, and you had to look at what was actually there. Some people arrived at that moment by choice, and some were brought to it by circumstances that moved faster than their willingness to see. Vivian had been brought to it, in the end, had not chosen the dissolution, had not chosen the humiliation of a husband who paraded his new arrangement through the rooms they had built together. She had not chosen the occasion, but she had chosen what to do with it. That was the thing she would carry forward. Not the settlement, not the case, not the $550,000 bid in a chandelier-lit ballroom, though she would carry those too, in their way. What she would carry was the knowledge that she had been reduced to a footnote in a story about her own life, and she had picked up the pen. You didn't have to be young to do that. You didn't have to be without damage or uncertainty or the long accumulated weight of years. You didn't have to be righteous, and you didn't have to be sure, and you didn't have to wait for the ground to be perfectly solid before you stood on it. You just had to be willing to see clearly and act on the seeing. She reached the building and went up. The apartment was quiet and warm and hers. The flowers in the entrance hall needed replacing. She would get them tomorrow. Something yellow, she thought. Something that held light. She put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window while it heated, looking down at Park Avenue in the early February dusk, the cars and the people and the long exhale of a city being exactly what it was. 57 years old, divorced. Beginning something whose shape was not yet clear and whose dimensions she would have to discover by living in them. Tired in the way of someone who had finished something real, and free in the way of someone who had remembered, after a long forgetting, that she was the one who got to decide what came next. The kettle boiled. She made the tea.